Hi, it is the end of a long day. I have been typing for about 7.5 hours today, planning for future events and answering emails, and I just glanced down at my to-do list, and the next thing on the to-do list is write an article, which means more typing, and frankly, I don't have it in me today. But this is a topic that I think I want to address in a brief way because it's the season of change, right? Graduations are happening. People are moving, they're ending their school year and deciding that's a good time to move their families from one place to another. And in the world that I live in the missionary and missionary's kid world, this is truly a season where transition is rampant. And as a result of that, I've gotten a lot of emails and done a lot of Skype calls and phone calls on this topic. People who reach out to me, some of them already in the freak out stage, saying, it's the end of this chapter. I don't know what the next chapter is, and I don't know how to proceed. And what I often do is point them towards good books that have been written on this topic that really give a rational plan of attack for executing change or executing transition. But that's not what I want to do now. What I want to do is just impart one little tidbit of wisdom, I think, that I have learned in my own transitions and that I generally pass on to those who write me on this topic. In order to support that little nugget, I am going to use a little bit of my own story, and I'm also going to use a deeply theological and highly respected resource called Raiders of the Lost Ark. Don't leave me yet, I'll explain that later. My last big change in my life, and a reluctant change, I'll admit to that, was about 6 years ago. When I was living in Germany, I was teaching at the Black Forest Academy. I loved everything about my life. I loved where I was, who I was working with, and that the totality of my life, growing up as an MK and then living as an adult MK and missionary, was finding its fulfillment and its completion in this school for kids who are just a few years behind me, but following in those same footsteps. And there was nothing I would have changed about who I was and what I was doing at that phase of my life until I think it was a September morning. I woke up and I had this sense, a strong, unmistakable sense that it was time for me to move on. Bear in mind that I had been there for nearly 20 years at the time. I had spent my entire life in Europe because I was born and raised in France. And all of a sudden, my marching orders were coming in an unmistakable way. I proceeded to spend weeks and months gripped with fear and anxiety, and trying to figure out exactly where he was leading me and exactly how I could get there. And I spent sleepless nights trying to figure out what could not be figured out from that standpoint, from that viewpoint. And what I learned is that I needed to be a little bit more like Harrison Ford, who is not a biblical figure, but who will stand in as one for the purposes of this illustration. There's a scene in the movie where he comes to the edge of a cliff or a precipice, and he looks down and it is literally bottomless. But he needs to move on. He needs to get to the other side of it. And I remember watching him, and you almost feel like you can see him weighing his options. Can he somehow MacGyver his way across the emptiness stretching out in front of him? Can he build a bridge? Can he slingshot himself across? What is it by human means that he can do to get himself to his destination? And then you see him kind of resigning himself to his fate and gathering up as much courage as he can. And then at the edge of this precipice, he puts out his foot and slowly brings it down. And the miracle of that scene is that as he's bringing it down, the ground materializes underneath it. A stepping stone of sorts materializes under his foot. And encouraged by that, he puts another foot out. And as it comes down, another stepping stone appears under that one. And I think that that is a good and healthy way to do change when the future cannot be predicted or planned for. Yes, there is a component that we can control. We do need to self-assess often enough that we know what our skill sets are, what our dreams are, what our ambitions are. That's important for setting the general direction of the next step that we're going to take. We need to surround ourselves, as I did back in Germany, with people who know us well enough and are wise enough that they can also contribute to our decision-making process. And then we need to pray. We need to pray that God will validate the choice we make with that peace that transcends understanding that we talk about so often. That doesn't mean that there will be complete certainty in that choice or that it will be absent of fear or doubt, self-doubt a lot of times, But in spite of those very human reactions, I think God can give us this certainty, this peace that, okay, do this. I've got you. So what I tell the MKs when they contact me by Skype or email or however it is, and when they're freaking out and saying, what do I do? How do I get where I'm going? Where am I going? The first thing I tell them is to wait a minute, back it up, and let's just consider the next step. The other advantage of this one step at a time incremental approach to decision making when change and a new life, a new universe, a new chapter is in front of us. Another advantage to that is that if by some fluke we make a wrong decision, we take a wrong step, it's going to be a lot easier for God to redirect us if we're approaching change incrementally rather than fixated on where we think it is that we need to be headed. So my encouragement to you, if you are at that stage of your life, whether you're an MK, a missionary adult, or just somebody who is facing imminent change, my advice to you is to just take a step back in order to consider what the next thing is, and not to get lost and frustrated and fearful about all those things that we can't determine in advance and that we can't plan for until we're actually faced with them. So Harrison Ford, my own story, all of that has proven to me, looking back over my journey from Germany, looking back at now this lineup of stepping stones that God was in, I can see the beauty of it. I can see the mystery of it. I can see the fulfillment that I have gained and the things that I have gone through with his help that have brought me exactly here. And from the vantage point of my little apartment in Germany, I never could have predicted that this is where I'd be 6 years later. But because I was willing to just consider the next step and then to courageously put my foot out and put it down where I thought God was leading me, because of that, I have made it here. And I wouldn't change that for the world. I hope that's a little bit helpful. It's probably a little more confusing than I intended to be. Maybe I do need to sit down and write that article, but I wanted to put that out there today because it's right there on my to-do list, and I'm going to get that to-do list done. Thanks, and have a good evening.